Thomas Jefferson once asked James Madison whether one generation of men has a right to find another, and concluded that the answer to this question lies in the fundamental principles of every government. While Jefferson and Madison corresponded overseas, the two often disagreed upon the ideals of the foundation of government, but their letters serve to remind us of how a constitutional government came to be defined. While Jefferson believed that no society can make a perpetual law because if it be enforced longer, it is an act of force, not right, Madison argued that antiquity makes constitutions clear and good standing. The foundations of a constitutional government lie in between the two founders' ideals, in a constitution that is broad enough to adapt the change that comes with every new generation, yet specific that it can be applied in order to limit government and actively protect individual rights.
A constitutional government maintains several defining characteristics. Firstly, it possesses a constitution, either written or unwritten. Secondly, it creates a rule of law. As Cicero said, we are all servants of the law in order that we may be free. A constitutional government also fosters the rights inherent to its people and cannot infringe upon them. Finally, the powers of government are finite by law, as seen in Article 1, Section 9, thus establishing limited government.
A constitutional government is, by definition, a limited government. John Locke asserts in his second treatise of government that the government derives all its authority from the people, and therefore has a responsibility to protect their rights, restricted in the fact that when it no longer does so, it can be abolished by those who established it. In order for a government to be truly constitutional, authority must originate from the constitution that the people created to govern. Furthermore, the Constitution must resemble higher law, placing a limit on what any one person can do.
Article 1, Section 2 gives the House of Representatives the sole power of impeachment, and the Senate the authority to decide whether to convict or acquit. This, in addition to Article 1, Section 3, limits government action and abuse by subjecting even those in positions of power to the rule of law under the Constitution. Harry E. Claiborne, a Nevada federal judge, was impeached and removed from office in 1984 for tax evasion because he, although in a position of power, was subject to the rule of law.
The U.S. Constitution contains multiple provisions that limit governmental power and abuse. For example, the separation of powers found in Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution guards liberty against the abuse of authority by distributing the powers into several individual centers. As James Madison wrote in Federalist 47, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny.
The second provision is the Supreme Court's power of judicial review and the check of the executive and legislative branches, expressed in Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution and in Marbury v. Madison. This power was demonstrated in Shelby County v. Holder, in which the Supreme Court used its authority to strike down Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 due to its restrictions on state delegated power under the 10th Amendment.
The third provision is outlined in Article 1, Section 9, which states that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, thus protecting an individual from arbitrary governmental imprisonment. Following 9/11, President George Bush made an effort to suspend habeas corpus for terror suspects through his military order of 2001. However, in Rasool v. Bush, the U.S. Supreme Court stated that the policy of preventing suspected detainees access to the protections of habeas corpus was unconstitutional.
A constitutional government is built upon a sovereignty that administers a just and equal liberty to its citizens, as well as prevents power from exceeding into tyranny. In Federalist 63, James Madison wrote that liberty may be endangered by the abuse of liberty, but also by the abuse of power. It was this idea of a balanced democracy that created the successful and influential written document that has become our country's constitution. Thank you.
Intern. We'll start with the question period. The first question is, what is popular sovereignty and how does it contribute to constitutional health?
In a constitutional government, it's highly important that the Constitution is the highest law, and in that, democracy is of the highest function within a constitutional government, especially in regards to higher law. Democracy can help with higher law, and it is I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, what is popular sovereignty and how does it contribute to constitutional government?
Popular sovereignty is the ideal that the people within a government can choose how the government is to be run or what ideals they will strive to put forth in their society and local community.
In early colonial experience, many colonies actually represented the idea of popular sovereignty through their promotion of a strong legislative branch. For example, the Massachusetts Constitution reflected high ideals of this through the fact that anyone in the legislative branch is elected through the people, by the people.
A social contract is also an example of popular sovereignty within a constitutional government because people are giving up some of their rights in order to be governed and protected by a group.
Thank you.
One of you defined the Constitution as both broad and specific. So leading to another question, then what is the purpose of a constitutional government?
As you can see in our Constitution, there's a very precarious balance between natural rights and classical Republican philosophy, and it's extremely important that this balance is maintained because the Constitution functions in being specific and broad so that it protects individual liberties, but also is representative of a majority of people.
John Locke asserts the idea that in a state of nature, we congregate and form a social contract in order to better and preserve our own liberties. And a constitution is actually exactly what this is, a social contract.
I have a question. How and why do free, fair, and regular elections serve to limit government?
Regular elections ensure that the people will constantly be taking an active role in their government by monitoring those in power, and the moment they feel that one of them is not doing his or her job correctly, they can have another election and remove that person from power and input a new, more qualified person for the job.
How do you feel today, we've seen a real participation problem in modern America for voting. How do you see the lack of participation as impacting limited government?
I think the lack of participation in our voting polls comes back to a lack of engaged and active citizenry. Jefferson promoted this idea a lot, especially in his ward republics, which were small divisions within counties in early America. He felt that if, going back to small homogeneous communities, that it was easier to represent people because people were so like-minded in small communities. And I think today we're faced with this problem of a huge diversity. And in schools, it's hard to educate on voting and government, and you just don't see a lot of it. And I think that's the reason why we have such low voter turnouts, is because people genuinely aren't being taught anything that is interesting them in voting.
Unfortunately, in the recent midterm elections, there was a 21.5% of youth voter turnout. Now, this could be due to several reasons, but one idea is because the youth does not align themselves with the classical Republican idea that citizenship should emphasize duties more so than rights. And in order to do so, they should look into their own limited government because it is enacted in order to give certain rights to the citizens so that they may give their voice and express their ideas of what a government should be.
In fact,
As John Adams said, liberty cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people. So I think the reason for low voter turnout is the fact that, like my colleague said, the young people today aren't educated enough about the government. And if they're not voting, then the government can no longer really protect their rights.
and because we as citizens elect our representatives and our leaders, we provide a check on government because only the ideals that we feel should be represented in government, make it to government. But if people don't vote, then that check is lost. Government has more power to do what it wants and stray away from what we believe to be right for ourselves.
Thank you. How does constitutional government differ from authoritarian government?
An authoritarian government, it may have a constitution, but the leader does not follow it. So he is above the Constitution, and it is that the Constitution itself is not the higher law within that society. The ruler is. North Korea has its own constitution, but Kim Jong-un does not follow that constitution very strictly. He's very much an authoritarian leader because he does basically whatever he wants to when running government.
As my colleague Kenneth said, a constitutional government is supposed to limit those in power. For example, in 2001, President George Bush tried to suspend the writ of habeas corpus to those suspected terrorists after the attacks of 9/11. Now the Supreme Court viewed this as unconstitutional because although he is in a power position, he is still subject to the rule of law.
Going off of what my colleague said, a constitutional government needs to follow the rule of law, so it needs to be the highest form of power. An example of not a constitutional government, but a government constitution would be China, who has changed their constitution multiple times within the last few years and doesn't really follow its first rule.
And just looking back historically, in our creation of our constitutional government, Jefferson and a lot of the founders were having a very hard time finding what democracy and republicanism would look like because they had seen and experienced so many problems within a monarchy. And Jefferson wrote in a letter to his colleague Samuel Kercheval explicitly stating that finding a republic would be really, really hard and that everything that wasn't authoritarian seemed like it was democracy because of the influences that had faced. And so I think it takes a lot of experimentation with how to best represent people in order to create a good constitutional government.
As a follow-up, I sense that we agree there is a natural superiority to constitutional government. Why then does 2/3 of today's population in the world live under authoritarianism? Why hasn't it become more common as
Well, Thomas Hobbes, who was one of the first people to argue for an authoritarian state rather than a democracy or a republic, recognized the fact that in a democracy or republic, voting and activism takes a long time. In a pure democracy where every citizen's vote is counted, that can take a very long time to organize and eventually count all of the votes. And Hobbes argued that with a single authoritarian leader, stability could be easily maintained because that one person could be decisive and make very important decisions very quickly.
An example today, Hong Kong has just ended the Umbrella Revolution. This revolution can be seen as a form of suppression by the government because the people in revolting are advocating for pure democracy within their government, and they want to be able to have their voice when electing representatives. Now, China does not follow their constitution to a point because they just recently tore down these boundaries and forced the protesters to leave and vacate the streets.
And do you think that, based on what you've identified as conditions, is this country at risk in 2014 of abandoning its limited government approach in the name of stability and security?
I think it comes down to that balance between natural rights and classical republicanism. There was a recent hacking of the U.S. Postal Service computer systems, and it was believed to have been done by Chinese hackers. And these hackers were able to gain access to 800,000 social security numbers of government employees. And so events like that make you wonder whether or not you should be building up the common defense in order to protect and provide for the common good. But that would involve stepping on individual rights and placing limitations on those individual rights. And I think that's the main problem today. And I think that's why we kind of juggle with this idea of whether or not we should stick to a limited government or we should enforce a more limited government, and it all revolves around personal rights.
Thank you.